Why is it that Radiohead's OK Computer is considered such a legendary album? You could point to any of the different aspects of the music, the harmony, the arrangements, the lyrics, etc., and certainly these all come into play, but I think a significant part of the average fan's fascination with this album comes from its placement within Radiohead's overall discography. Preceding it are Pablo Honey and The Bends, two albums of relatively accessible, straightforward alternative rock/Britpop. And then following it are Kid A and Amnesiac, two albums of esoteric electronics-infused art rock. Without the existence of OK Computer, which effectively straddles these two vastly different styles, it would almost be a little hard to believe that these other pairs of albums were recorded by the same band. In my video on Radiohead's harmonic vocabulary, a lot of the trends that I uncovered confirm OK Computer's role as a sort of transitional snapshot in Radiohead's artistic development. For instance, over the span of 5 albums, Radiohead gradually went from almost exclusively using the major key to having a slight preference for the minor key. OK Computer sits neatly in the middle of this trend. Additionally, the band's use of functional harmony became increasingly complex leading up to OK Computer, marking an inflection point as Kid A and Amnesiac shifted focus away from harmony and towards texture and arrangement. But OK Computer isn't the only Radiohead release to have this transitional quality. To start with, there's the My Iron Lung EP, which was recorded during sessions for The Bends. And even though the EP's title track did appear on The Bends, its Mixolydian key and angular guitar parts are a little uncharacteristic for this early period. The remaining songs on the EP were, in essence, those that the band felt did not fit the Bends' more accessible style. These include the borderline prog rock rhythms on the minor key track The Trickster and the frankly bizarre chord progression on Punch Drunk Lovesick Singalong. Additionally, there's the Airbag How Am I Driving EP, which collects most of the B-sides recorded during the OK Computer sessions and which shows a comparable degree of sophistication to OK Computer itself. My favorite song from this latter EP, and the subject of this video, is Polyethylene Parts 1 and 2. This song encapsulates a lot of different elements in the evolution of Radiohead's sound, in particular using unusual rhythms and complex harmony without sacrificing the catchiness and relatively simple arrangement of the band's alternative rock roots. Let's take a listen. The song starts with a standalone section, the part 1 described in the song title, which features vocals and acoustic guitar playing a relatively simple progression. We're in the key of B minor, and all of these chords are diatonic. In fact, the 5 chord is not even the common, but technically non-diatonic, 5 dominant 7, but rather a 5 minor chord, which gives this section an especially gentle, sad mood. The vocal melody is likewise purely diatonic, with the exception of the non-diatonic F natural that begins most of the repetitions. Tom York has a curious affection for this type of blue note, which I'd speculate came about as a way to harness the warbly, unsteady intonation that was apparent in his early singing style. And this very conventional flat 5th blue note is in line with the more conventional approach of Radiohead's early career. Another note worth pointing out is this high A over the G major chord. It's still diatonic, but very much a color tone, essentially producing a G major add 9 chord, which sounds quite pretty. Anyway, after 4 repetitions of this progression, part 1 ends, and we proceed to part 2, which has little to do with part 1 musically. And this is where things start to get really interesting. Part 2's A section adds a second guitar and repeats a simple yet distinctive riff. The most conspicuous feature here is the time signature, which alternates between 9/8 and 4/4. This is pretty unusual, and not simply because of the changing meter. Usually when you alternate between 2 different meters, they still at least share a common beat. Even when mixing simple quarter note meters with complex 8th note meters, you'd still mostly count in quarter notes, adding in a half beat to fit the odd meter. And in fact, you could interpret this section's 9/8 meter like this. But 9/8 is often treated not as a complex meter, but a compound triple meter, consisting of 3 dotted quarter note beats. And indeed, we see here that the 9/8 measures are broken up into 3 evenly spaced chords. and this contrast between quarter note and dotted quarter note beats shows up in this song's other sections as well. The harmony here is also somewhat unusual. We're obviously not in B minor anymore, but it's not immediately clear what key we are in. The first three chords, F major, C major, and E minor, are all diatonic to the key of C major or its relative minor key, A minor. But then there's an A major chord, which if you pair it with the previous E minor chord seems to suggest the A mixolydian mode. As the song goes on, it becomes clear that A is our key center, so at least we can assign consistent chord functions regardless of what mode we want to use. Now, it's pretty common to borrow minor chords into a major or mixolydian key. In fact, this progression is reminiscent of a common rock progression which uses repeated plagal movements, that is, moving down by fourths, to move from parallel minor to major tonality. The prototypical example of this is the rock standard Hey Joe, notably covered by Jimi Hendrix, but there are many other examples as well. If you chart the 5-chord version of this progression on the chromatic circle of fifths, it's easy to see the general pattern. The first 3 chords can fit into one key, but then each subsequent chord drags the frame of reference one step sharper. The progression in Polyethylene has 2 subtle differences from this. First, it substitutes the 3rd chord of this progression, which in the key of A would normally be a G major, with its relative minor, E minor. And then, to reach its final chord, it moves 2 steps sharper. Even though we can still fit E minor and A major into a single key, the auditory impact of this bigger key change is especially bold or triumphant. It even gives this final A major chord a certain sense of surprise, which may even suggest that it's in fact a major feature borrowed into the minor key, not the other way around. And indeed, the next section begins with a direct change in chord quality from this final A major to an A minor. Overall, if I had to choose a single key for part 2 of Polyethylene, which in fact influences my choice of key signature here, I would go with A minor. In this B section, there's a slightly longer chord progression, and the vocals also return with a new melody. Once again, there's a repeated change in time signature. This time it's 2 measures of 6/8 followed by 2 measures of 4/4. Just like 9/8, 6/8 is often interpreted as a compound meter, with each beat lasting a dotted quarter note. The timing of the chord changes here fits this structure, as does the phrasing of the vocal part, albeit with the first quarter note omitted. However, the drums take a distinctly different approach, adopting a backbeat pattern which ignores the 6/8 meter's usual structure. It's more natural to parse this pattern as being 3 measures of 2/4, with the subsequent 4/4 measures continuing 2/4's even feel. In a way, this is a simple polymeter between 6/8 and 2/4. So instead of how the A section alternated between quarter note and dotted quarter note beats, the B section uses both types of beats simultaneously. Now let's take a look at the harmony. As stated before, we're now more clearly in the key of A minor, and the first 4 chords are entirely diatonic. Though the movements from A minor to E minor and from F major to C major each have a plagal quality that imitates the plagal movements from the A section. Next we run into a B flat major, which is a non-diatonic flat 2 major chord, needing to borrow a single additional flat from the A Phrygian mode. And then finally, after another A minor chord, we end on a D major, which is also non-diatonic but borrows from the opposite direction, a single additional sharp giving us a 4 major chord from the A Dorian mode. The phrasing used for this last chord should be familiar. It's quite similar to how the final A major chord was played during the A section. And indeed, from the perspective of D mixolydian, instead of the A section's A mixolydian, we see that these last 3 chords have functions of flat 6 major, 5 minor, and 1 major. This is almost the same as the A section's functions, albeit missing the flat 3 major chord, but still retaining that distinct 5 minor to 1 major change. It's just that now the whole pattern's key is shifted 1 step flat in the circle of fifths. Things get even more complicated moving into the C section with a new chord progression and metric structure, although there are still several elements that are borrowed from the first 2 sections. To start with, the pattern of time signatures here is now 1 measure of 4/4, 2 measures of 6/8, and then 1 final measure of 4/4. The phrasing of the 6/8 measures is somewhat different than before as well. The first one has a unison pattern of just 3 quarter notes, perhaps it might be more accurate to call this 3/4, but the second measure strictly follows the dotted quarter note beats. In fact, unlike the B section, even the drums go along with this rhythm here. As for the harmony, the first chord is quite strange, a B major, which on the surface seems like it would need to be borrowed from the very sharp A Lydian mode. And in fact, the movement from the previous section's D major to this B major is actually a pretty common major-to-major chromatic mediant change into the Lydian mode. But the A Lydian mode contains a G sharp, whereas the vocal melody here has a G natural. This flatter note has a similar impression to the blue note style that opened the song in part 1. But it also points towards the B major being not a Lydian mode borrowing, but the 5 chord in the key of E minor, which the A Dorian is a mode of and which the D major chord was originally borrowed from. However, the B major does not directly resolve to the E minor chord, instead moving to its relative major, G major, another major-to-major chromatic mediant change. Nonetheless, it gets to the E minor right afterwards through a diatonic descending bass line. The timing of these 3 chords fits nicely into this measure, and likewise for the timing of the 2 subsequent chords, F major and C major, which open the A section with a similar dotted quarter note beat structure. But unlike the A section, whose 9/8 measure's 3rd chord, E minor, gets a bit closer to the eventual A major on the circle of fifths, here we skip right from the C major to the A major. These 2 chords don't fit into a single diatonic key, instead making yet another major-to-major chromatic mediant change. The vocal melody also highlights the contrast between these 2 keys, using both the F natural over the F major chord and the C sharp over the A major. This melodic fragment is vaguely reminiscent of scales that mix major and minor features, such as the Mixolydian flat 6 or the Phrygian dominant scales. And finally, since this progression ends on A major, the last 4/4 measure imitates the A section's phrasing of this chord. Overall, there's a lot of sophistication in Part 2's various chord progressions. This includes a diverse set of modal interchanges, a couple of major-to-major chromatic mediant changes, and the recontextualization of the 5 minor to 1 major change into a new key. In fact, if we apply the functional harmonic complexity calculation that I came up with, this song would get 15 points, which would make it the 9th most complex Radiohead song by functional harmony when compared to all the album tracks I covered in my original analysis. However, unlike a lot of the harmonically complex songs from Radiohead's later career, pretty much every chord in Polyethylene is voiced as a simple major or minor triad, in keeping with the accessible alternative rock approach that Radiohead favored early on. And of course, there are other features in Polyethylene that are in keeping with its identity as a transitional piece. Its large assortment of metric changes is perhaps only rivaled by Radiohead's later career song Sail to the Moon, though on the other hand the actual syncopation inside the meters in Polyethylene turns out to be fairly simple. And likewise, the instrumentation sticks largely to the guitar, bass, drums, and vocals that were typical of the bends. In many ways, Polyethylene is archetypal of the OK Computer era, and to me that makes it just as interesting as anything from OK Computer itself. This concludes my analysis of Polyethylene parts 1 and 2. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain.